Only the most astute student would know what that song was. It was the USC fight song for the big game that we have tonight against Hawaii. And poof, like magic, here I am. Alright, we're going to continue with chapter 3. We're on page 68 in your book. Today we're going to, 67, page 67 in your book. We're going to cover the water cycle, and then we need to do the carbon cycle, and we need to deal with the nitrogen cycle. All of these guaranteed to be on your exams because they're a favorite thing to test. A students, I got to tell you, just about every exam I've ever seen has some diagram of the water cycle on it that requires you to answer questions. So we're going to emphasize, you've covered the water and the carbon cycle before, but we're going to emphasize what's important concerning environmental science, because there are some specific instances and details in these cycles that you need to be particularly aware about. So here you go. Alright, well here it is, a nice diagram of the water cycle for you, and it's let's go over the things that you remember. And first of all, it's kind of interesting to note that once again this is a cycle that is powered by the sun. So truly you can make the case that hydroelectric power is solar power, because it is generated, or it is pushed, the whole water cycle is derived from solar activity. And that causes evaporation of water that's on land. Once the evaporation happens, it goes up into the atmosphere, forms clouds, and when clouds form, the heavier water droplets condense, and then we have something called precipitation. Now, not all of the evaporation that we know of comes from the surfaces of land and water, like oceans and lakes and rivers, but also the evaporation comes from soil. Now, this may be a word that you're not aware of, you need to keep track of, because it's been on your exams before, and that's the term evapotranspiration. First of all, you got to see that one word, transpiration, there. That's a big deal. And I'm sure you remember what transpiration is, but if you don't, it's basically the evaporation of water out of plants. And that happens primarily at the leaves. In fact, almost exclusively at the leaves. Water is drawn up through the roots, and it combines with the carbon dioxide in the leaf so that plants can make their glucose. Remember that formula that we learned for photosynthesis. But what water doesn't end up in the photosynthetic process sits in the leaves and gets slowly evaporated. Well, we have a special word for that. It's called transpiration. Think of it like perspiration in humans. In fact, think of it as plants sweating. But that water, because that leaf is so perfectly flat and an ideal attractor of the sun, also causes that water vapor or that water in the leaf to evaporate. That process is called transpiration. So that is one of the very important specific things for you to know in environmental science about the water cycle. Another very important one is this concept of infiltration. Some of the rainwater that lands on land begins to seep into the soil. If the plants don't take it up to do photosynthesis, that water will continue to seep down into the ground. That process is called infiltration, and it is an ecosystem service, because whatever's in that water gets purified. As the water seeps through the soil traps any impurities that are in that water, and it ends up seeping down below the surface into what we call groundwater. Now, you all know what groundwater is. For us, it's the aquifer. Slowly but surely, all of this underground water makes its way to the lowest point, by gravity. And so sometimes the lowest point is up here in a river somewhere, and so the groundwater will seep its way through the soil and end up in a river that ends up flowing into an ocean. And also it will seep down and charge the aquifers, filling that aquifer and causing that aquifer slowly but surely to seep its way to its lowest point and seep down into the oceans. So there's your second big important word that is environmental specific part of the water cycle. And here's the third: surface runoff. Runoff is a big deal as we learn more about environmental science, because rainwater that lands on land, if it doesn't have time to slowly seep through the soil and charge an aquifer, will just become what's known as surface runoff. And that rainwater will find its way to a lowest point, but it will, because of the speed with which the water moves, carry along with it any chemicals or things that are in the ground. Or in our case, you've probably seen water run off. It lands on the street. It lands on driveways. And carrying with that water is whatever nasty chemical happened to be on the street, little drips of oil, for instance, from a car. And that surface runoff ends up in bodies of water as well. And I'm not just talking about concrete. I'm talking about surface runoff. For instance, if you just put fertilizer on your lawn and then you have a big heavy rain, some of that fertilizer will never even make it to a plant. It will never even seep down into the ground. It will simply run off and end up in a river somewhere or a lake. And that problem of surface runoff is something we'll cover in another chapter. So that is another very important part of the water cycle when it comes to environmental science. So there you have them. Evapotranspiration, especially that word transpiration. The infiltration that happens through soil that recharges the aquifer, and surface runoff. If you have any questions about the water cycle, bring them to class with you, and we will move on now to the carbon cycle. The most important things for you to remember about the carbon cycle, even though this diagram looks very complicated and convoluted, is that the carbon cycle is essentially the movement of carbon from carbon dioxide into glucose in a process known as, you guessed it, photosynthesis. There it is, number one on our chart here. And it's also the cycling of the carbon that's in the glucose back into the carbon dioxide in a process that we covered just the other day called cellular respiration. Now, there's a lot more environmental issues associated with the carbon cycle than just those. But at the heart of the movement of carbon through the ecosystem, that's what we're talking about. Now, there are some intermediate stopovers of this carbon in the form either of carbon dioxide or of buried carbon in the form of living things that have died millions of years ago. And that's called carbon sequestration. That carbon is trapped down deep in the ground. That makes the carbon cycle nice and even. Well, let's go through this thing, and you can see here the producers convert the CO2 into sugars. We, and all living things, take the sugars and convert them back into CO2. But you are full of carbon. All living things are full of carbon, and some of that carbon ends up going down into the ground. It's buried. I mean, that's sort of the carbon basis of our fossil fuels. Things that were dead, that died millions of years ago, have made their way down deep into the ground. Now, here's where human activities have sort of unbalanced the carbon cycle, because that is where that carbon would have stayed down deep, and it would eventually have been released in some way or form. For instance, it might have seeped into ocean waters, or it might have escaped through a volcanic activity. This is, natural. This is natural activity. But if there were no humans here, all of the carbon that would be in the ground would be sequestered there. It would be trapped there. And of course, since the Industrial Revolution, our extraction of fossil fuels and the burning of them has put way more carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. And that has kind of unbalanced the carbon cycle. Let's see. So we got human extraction of fossil fuels brings carbon back up to the surface, and it's combusted, right? That's where we burn the fossil fuels. Let's talk about the carbon cycle that's in the ocean, because this is a rather big deal that we've just noticed in the last 5 to 10 years. We've noticed the buildup of calcium carbonate, CaCO3. We've noticed the buildup of calcium carbonate in our oceans, especially along the surface of the oceans here. And what's happening there is because we have unbalanced the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide that's in the air, and the Earth is 70% water, there's a lot more carbon dioxide right along the interface of the very surface of the ocean and the air. Since the air has carbon dioxide in it, some of that CO2 that sits in the air and lies right on the very surface of the ocean dissolves into the ocean. So we're noticing that our ocean waters have an increased level of dissolved carbon dioxide. Now, this carbon dioxide isn't just going to sit around in the water. It's going to react with other chemicals that are in the ocean and form other chemicals. And that is what's happening with this buildup of calcium carbonate. That CO2, that increased level of CO2 in the ocean, reacts with free available calcium, and that calcium, along with the carbon dioxide, forms calcium carbonates. Now, there is a certain amount of CO2 that's supposed to be in the oceans because of the normal activities of producers and consumers, and also the activity of decomposers. Decomposers break down material, but again, they're doing cellular respiration, so they're releasing carbon dioxide just like you do, just like every cell in every creature does during cellular respiration. So the most important things for you to remember about carbon and the carbon cycle are that they are driven primarily through the processes of photosynthesis and respiration. So the true cycling of carbon is just going from a CO2 molecule into a glucose molecule, and then from a glucose molecule back into a CO2 molecule. We are unbalancing the carbon cycle with our extraction of fossil fuels that are down deep. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the CO2 might still have been released into the air naturally through things like combustion that happens when there's a volcanic eruption. But our introduction of the added CO2 is a problem. Alright, that's the water cycle, that's the carbon cycle. I made this short and sweet for you. There is a video that I'd like to show you as part of this, and I will show that to you. I think I'll wait and I'll show that to you in class. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks. Bye.